Dear colleagues and friends, new and old, it's a pleasure and an honor to present these ideas to you for your consideration. In 1946, Melanie Klein published her paper, Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms, in which she coined the term projective identification. In the same year, C.G. Jung published The Psychology of the Transference. Klein's paper implied the mother-infant object relation and a conception of parts of one person put into and identified with another person, the process of projective identification. Jung's study employed the arcane symbolism of alchemy to grasp the same phenomenology, as I hope to show you today. Klein's paper, as Donald Meltzer has noted, had an electrifying impact upon the analysts who were closely working with her. Jung's hardly had such an impact. For most Jungians, let alone analysts of other schools of thought, his alchemical model often seems too abstracted from here and now clinical practice. Yet it is in Jung's study of the transference that I believe we can find an approach to projective identification that richly elaborates the findings of Klein and other psychoanalysts for whom the concept is absolutely central. Projective identification is a psychic mechanism whereby the self experiences the unconscious fantasy of translocating itself or aspects of itself into an object for exploratory or defensive purposes. Projective identification can lead to states of confusion and to a weakening of consciousness that allows for emotional flooding by unconscious processes. In extreme instances, a relationship dominated by projective identification can even trigger psychotic episodes. Through projective identification, one has the unconscious fantasy, to one degree or another, of being invisible. This can become extreme, leading to a sense of a loss of soul and a terror that the self cannot ever be found. The negative aspects of projective identification, such as confusion, identity loss, or panic, often appear dominant. However, projective identification also has the power, as Rosemary Gordon has explained, to actually break down psychic boundaries within a person, and I would add as well as between him and his object world. This breakdown of structures is essential to any qualitative personality change. Gordon has noted that what Jung called participation mystique, unconscious identity, psychic infection, and induction are synonyms for projective identification. She also pointed out that the process Jung called feeling into, as representing positive aspects of projective identification, here underlying aesthetic awareness and, of course, empathy. Jung often stresses the negative aspects of projective identification. His goal in therapy, as stated in his commentary to The Secret of the Golden Flower, is the dissolution of participation mystique. But this goal appears questionable when Jung then explains that once the self becomes the center of personality, participation mystique is done away with and, I quote, results in a personality that only suffers in the lower stories, as it were, but in the upper stories is singularly detached from painful as well as from joyful happenings." End quote. It would appear from this that accepting a degree of mind-body splitting is the price one must pay for totally doing away with projective identification. In these remarks, Jung was centering upon what he called the compulsion and impossible responsibility that can accompany interactions dominated by projective identification. Then again, in his study of the visions of Zosimos, Jung strikes a different tone and regards participation mystique as underlying alchemical projections which, to quote, are a special instance of the mode of thinking typified by the idea of the microcosm. Generally, Jung is aware of the potentially creative and destructive aspects of projective identification. He is influenced by both possibilities to a strong degree in his analysis of the alchemical imagery in the Rosarium Philosophorum, his Ariadne thread through the complexities of the transference. Later in this talk, I will show slides of the Rosarium when we look at them in some detail. The dominant image there is of a hermaphrodite, which often represents the soul, or what the alchemists called the vinculum, the linking aspect between male and female opposites, between mind and body. The hermaphrodite can represent negative fusion states, but also sublime states of union, both of which can include projective identification. Psychology of the transference. Jung's main statement on the transference is centrally concerned with the phenomenology of projective identification. There he stresses unconscious processes that, to quote, have an inductive effect on the unconscious of the doctor. This theme repeats itself in variations throughout his study. Jung describes the phenomenology of the projective identification as activating the unconscious and the archetypal transference. To quote, "The doctor becomes affected and has as much difficulty in distinguishing between the patient and what has taken possession of him as has the patient himself. The activated unconscious appears as a flurry of unleashed opposites, such as hate and love, and calls forth an attempt to reconcile them, so that, in the words of the alchemists, the great panacea, the medicina catholica, may be born." End quote. Thus, the self may be born out of the process initiated by projective identification as it uncovers the prized states of the negredo and massa confusa. These are themes I will return to. Since this paper will employ Jung's approach to the Rosarium, I want to emphasize that he used this alchemical set of woodcuts and associated commentaries in a most extraordinary way. The alchemical tradition only rarely employed two people working together. There was little expressed concern for mutual processes. This tradition, like Tantrism, with which the imagery of the Rosarium has important similarities, was primarily interested in the union of opposites within the individual. Interpersonal interactions would, at best, have been a tool along this path. Yet, Jung took the rosarium as a series of images representing the unconscious process between two people. I think that represented a great stroke of genius. But we are then led to follow up the implications of his model. In this regard, we must recognize that alchemical speculations addressed processes in what they termed the subtle body. Jung's analogy in his work was to the linking between anima and animus, not the conscious personalities of two people. Yet, the problematic issue that must be faced and focused upon is that of where such processes occur. They do not take place inside or outside of individuals. Transitional phenomenon, as Susan Derry has emphasized in her critique of Winnicott's idea, which has similarities to the alchemical idea of subtle body, transitional phenomena cannot be located either inside, outside, or even in between people. It refers to another dimension of existence that can only be perceived with the eye of the imagination. In fact, notions of location are inadequate to begin with. Generally speaking, the alchemical approach addressed processes in such third areas. They called this area Mercurius. He also was the process occurring there, and his transformation was a goal of the opus. My main point in this paper is that projective identification has the goal of transforming the third area. We may often refer to it as in between people, or as a transitional area, for it can at times be experienced in this way. But the more deeply it is entered, the more such spatial considerations vanish. We are dealing here with an imaginal world, a mundus imaginalis, that has its own processes and can also evolve. Individuals can partake of its processes. Indeed, as Jung says, as two parties get involved in the transformation of the third, Mercurius, they themselves are transformed in the process. Mercurius, or the subtle body, is usually a hidden area through which projections pass, as Jung emphasized in his Zarathustra seminars. Alchemical speculations addressed its reality and its transformation, for which projective identification was a vital force. Projective identification, writes James Grotstein, may be employed for exploratory or defensive purposes. Employed defensively, projective identification rids the contents of one's mind, or, when the experience is severe, the mind itself. An object hitherto separate becomes either the container for the negated contents or confused with it through identification. Such workings of projective identification can be very painful to the object who is to be the container for contents projected into it by the subject. Here is an example. A person began a conversation with me, midway through which he paused. This pause appeared suddenly. In the context of our conversation, it would have been more natural for him to have continued with a remark or some question. He behaved as if nothing was wrong. But it soon seemed that each of us wanted the other to say something. As he looked at me, I began to feel awkward. The pause rapidly became more painful. I felt called upon to somehow bridge what was becoming intolerable. During the painful pause, projective identification was occurring. He was putting his blank mind into me, attempting to use me as a container for his absence or mental blankness that overtook him midway in our conversation. He was putting this absence, encased as it was in a paranoid shell, into me, and then watching me, while hoping I would somehow give him his functioning mind back. Consequently, when I said something to disengage and only end the encounter, he was angry. I was left with a guilty feeling that I had failed a test. I then felt coerced to return to emotional contact with him and somehow repair the break between us. He did not get his mind back during the pause, but his anger jarred him out of his schizoid state and into more affective contact. So the event just passed by, unintegrated in its meaning and certain to occur again. Now, as important as it is for communication, I believe projective identification has a larger role. It is goal-oriented. It can both create and break down imaginal structures between two people, structures that are as real as the phenomenon itself. These structures, like dreams, are normally unseen in consensual or waking consciousness. For example, in the previous vignette of aspects of a person's mind being projected into me, one could imagine the following unconscious structure defining our interactional field. We may think of it in terms of a hermaphrodite, an image that has one body and two heads, familiar from the alchemical woodcuts from the Rosarium. The conjoined body could be an image of the fusion desires between us, which I felt as a need to somehow maintain contact with him, while the two heads could represent the contrary tendency towards splitting, evidenced in my desire to lose contact with him in order to avoid the pain of mental blankness. Projective identification can initiate the process of accessing and transforming interactive fields of linking or relation, as they are imaged, for example, by the couples in the Rosarium. The alchemical process is devoted to overcoming the dangers of fusion states, of the tendency to concretize processes in the third area into something belonging to the ego. The entire process may be seen as a continual refinement of the hermaphrodite's shadow side, which is a regressive fusion with the ego personality. Jung was extremely critical of this aspect of the hermaphrodite in the psychology of the transference. The existence of what we know as projective identification was crucial for the initiation of the alchemical opus. Apprehending it was synonymous with the fixing of Mercurius, and could result in finding the prima materia or massa confusa, or of arriving at the nigredo. In clinical practice, whatever the artful ways of the practitioner, identifying projective identification is dependent upon his being somehow distanced from extremely strong feelings which, a moment ago, he felt were perfectly justified. Bion describes this distance as a temporary loss of insight, without which the analyst would continue to play out a part in the patient's fantasy and would fail to recognize that he is being manipulated to play that part. Now, just how the analyst gains emotional distance and reflection will vary greatly. And it can cover a spectrum ranging from his own splitting to what I would call the moral act of imagining the effect on the patient should he, the analyst, actually speak to him or behave in ways he feels are so totally justified. Such personal, private, imaginal acts by the analyst will often jar him out of his arrogant complacency and into the awareness that a very complex and dangerous process has been at work. For example, during a session with a patient, I began to feel that her existence, even her right to breathe and have any thoughts at all of her own, had to first be preceded by flowing through me. I was a dictatorial container. I felt as if it was right that she be contained in me, that all her autonomy and thoughts exist only if these be contained by me. Anything else, I believed in that moment, was off target, off the mark, away from what was important for her and the process. I felt this to be for her own good. I felt this dictum seething through me. Until I jarred myself out of this state, it felt perfectly right. Now, in the previous vignette of the pause, which was a non-analytical example, I was only later able to recognize that I was being manipulated to recover someone's lost mind. During the pause, I had a strong belief that my reactions were totally justified. The following case I want to bring to you more extensively demonstrates the kind of imagery that can evolve out of imaginally reflecting projective identification dynamics. A woman began her session by looking at me in a very penetrating way and saying, "When I see that bored look on your face, that is, when I believe I see it, I just want to go away. I get anxious and I withdraw." I felt stung by her criticism. Was I bored with her? I had been in the past. I did not feel that way today, and certainly not when she had spoken to me. Why did I feel jarred by what she said, I wondered. Where was she seeing me clearly? I realized that if I retained contact with her, while also being connected to myself, then that also caused her to become very anxious and to withdraw. And so I told her that, and she acknowledged it. And after some reflection, she looked at me, and then I found myself looking away, just for a second. But ever so slightly, for that second, I did avoid her. I told this to her, being quite certain she had not seen it, but she had also seen it. As she reflected on her experience of my looking away from her, she became very upset. This, she realized, was not only with me, but with all her experiences with men. For, as she expressed it, they don't want to connect to contact with me. They run away. Why did you run away? I had no answer. In fact, I felt surprised by her question. In revealing that I had ever so slightly tended to withdraw, I felt I was offering something that would have made her grateful. Instead, she was now angry with me. I had clearly opened up more than I had bargained for. So I thought about it. Why did I run away? Did I, in fact, really want any emotional contact with her? And in the process, I realized that the slight looking away I did was actually chronic in our interactions. I then began to have the very angry feeling and thought that she wouldn't let me have any of my own process. I felt I couldn't be in myself at all, but always had to be linked to her and focused on her and our interaction. After a moment, my anger passed and I came to my senses. I told her of the thought and process I had just gone through. I did not totally ascribe my state to an induced process, but it did have the sense of foreignness common to projective identification. I wasn't sure where it came from me, her, or the interaction. And in telling her about it, I had hoped to bring these destructive contents to consciousness. I was open to the fantasy being not only a product of hers or my own psyche, but also a spontaneous product of our interactive field, a mundus imaginalis that cannot be reduced to individual psyches. Communicating these feelings, noting their foreignness, but also that they were part of my own reactions, led her to a flood of memories of how she had so often been treated exactly as I had described, as a greedy and controlling person who allowed nobody his own autonomy. Her careful and genuine response then caused me to wonder if, in fact, the reason that I had slightly turned away from her, and often had in the past, was simply a projective identification dynamic in the Kleinian sense of her putting into me this withdrawing, sadistic expectancy. Would any reflections on third areas and imaginal couples, I wondered, only be a way of distancing from a more direct encounter? Seeing the projective identification as something of hers, being acted out by me, was useful, but it soon felt unsatisfying to both of us. After all, why did I act it out? What did this say about me and my real feelings about her? Thinking these thoughts led me to have an impetus within myself to protest that, in fact, I did a good job of not acting out, that I only barely succumbed relative to the experiences she has had with other people. But small or slight withdrawals can actually be more sinister than outright accusations that someone is boring. For these withdrawals cloak themselves in the lie of only being a slight failing in a state of otherwise real contact. If I was going to be truthful, something else was needed. So I returned with her to examining our interaction. It seemed clear that we were acting as a couple who did not want union. In this dynamic, when she contacted me, I withdrew. And when I contacted her, as was true many times prior, she filled with anxiety and withdrew. we seemed to be ruled by an interactive couple whose roles we alternately played out. Now, in approaching our interaction in this way, we submitted to a third thing having its way with us. Like the alchemical mercurius described by Jung, it was, quote, an elusive, deceptive, ever-changing content that possessed us like a demon who flitted about between us as the third party in our alliance and continued its game, sometimes impish and teasing, sometimes really diabolical, end quote. And, most crucially, such a presence could be sensed through an imaginal act, a metaphorical grasp of our interaction, a way of speaking about it as if we were constructing a dream that might be going on, a dream that was filling in for our missing consciousness. Our interaction could best be grasped by thinking that two couples were present, the patient and myself, and an unconscious one, an unconscious dyad. Now, in this way, we established the presence of an imaginal couple that seemed to thrive on sadomasochistic dynamics. For example, I could follow its rhythms and ever so slightly withdraw from her, with surgical precision causing her pain. She, in turn, could flee from me and have a similar effect, a painful non-mirroring of my eros. The act of imaginally seeing this couple freed us from its power, much like the technique in active imagination of objectifying an affect. The result was that a new field of felt union began to manifest between us. That was the crucial item. Active imagination, imaginal sight, had a transformative result on the nature of the couple. We could then feel ourselves working together in an interactive field that seemed to have its own creativity. Images and feelings appeared that had a newfound spontaneity that we had rarely known together. Now, I now found myself in the midst of an awful fantasy. I began to see, in my mind's eye, and fleetingly, imaginally, in the space between us, a wild red-haired man, much like old pictures of Ares, the wild man. He and I tended to merge, and he, me, was very angry with her. The anger, indeed rage, had the following form, the following voice. Anything that goes wrong here is your fault. If you dare to split from me or in any way mess up now, you're in for it. Now, I was very surprised by the power of this fantasy. And when I told it to her, she recognized it as her greatest fear. She became very upset and told me that she had always been held accountable for anything that went wrong in states of union. Now, what about the wild man? In a sense, he is the sadistic urge that I had partaken of in, quote, small amounts in withdrawal. It was now revealed in its more devastating persecutory form. But the act of imagining this together, with reference to the couples, both creative ones and soulless ones, that seemed to be structuring our interaction, now led again to something else. For she recognized the wild man to be her energy, her libido, or yang power, that she always felt men hated and withdrew from. When she dared to feel this power, as she was now able to in the moment, men accused her of being unrelated. At least in that moment, she had the experience of her phallic power not being destructive, not ruining union. Now, as long as I was dealing with the parts put into me, so to speak, by the patient, or parts I put into her in counter-projective identification, that in rage she would then attempt to put back into me, I was approaching our interaction through a Kleinian metaphor. I was dealing with projected parts and attempting to understand them through a kind of Cartesian, Newtonian, spatial grid of insides and outsides. But when we perceive the interactive couple in mutable and interchanging states of fusion, union, or radical non-union, felt as states of deadness or complete absence of linking, all of which could change into each other, we began to enter a different kind of space, not one of things such as the parts projected, but of couples and their relations. This space of relations is, I believe, a transitional area between the space-time world, where processes may be characterized as the interaction of objects, and the collective unconscious, or what Jung called the pleroma. The physicist David Bohm has called this the implicate order. Healing for Jung depends upon linking to the pleromatic level. Images have the capacity to lead us into the mystery of the pleroma or implicate order. Marilyn Ferguson has discussed this beautifully. She writes that T.S. Eliot's poems are full of such images. The still point of the turning world, she noted, is neither flesh nor fleshless, neither arrest nor movement. Eliot said, and do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered, except for the point, the still point. There would be no dance, and there is only the dance. Ferguson also records a Buddhist sutra as the most extraordinary ancient description of this level in which oneness, not separable events, is the guiding thread of experience. In the heaven of Indra, there is said to be a network of pearls, so arranged that if you look at one, you see the others reflected in it. In the same way, each object in the world is not merely itself, but involves every other object, and in fact is every other object. Now, one further item. The physician and scientist, Alex Comfort, has recently suggested that Bohm's idea of an implicate order is the same as a space in which relations, not things related, but relations per se, are the central feature. While images have the power to link to the implicate order, the particular images that mediate to relations may have a special role here. My belief is that by discovering an unconscious couple through its fragments known from projective identification, we move into a third area that can link to the pleromatic fullness of the implicate order. We thus follow the fragments known in projective identification back to their pleromatic roots. The couple itself then becomes an image with the power to engage us in the oneness of the implicate order. There, as Jung teaches, consonant with the ancient and Hermetic tradition, healing resides. The space in which we can grasp the imagery of a couple whose ever-changing dance is the only reality is a third area that links to the unitary world of the implicate order, or the pleroma, collective unconscious. Becoming conscious of this area is a new level of awareness. It is best to not identify the third area with either implicate or space-time orders, but to allow it to be a linking domain that cannot be cast into spatial categories. The third area is neither inside, outside, nor in between people. This area is also neither material nor psychic, neither flesh nor fleshless, but rather a subtle body, a realm of ethers, of concepts long discarded, but in need of our reconsideration. How did the alchemist apprehend projective identification processes and turn them into creative, structure-creating and transforming modes? How did he approach those processes in which, as Jung says, the alchemist no longer knew whether he was melting the mysterious amalgam in the crucible or whether he was the salamander glowing in the fire? End quote. This process of psychological induction, Jung goes on to say, quote, invariably causes the two parties to get involved in the transformation of the third, Mercurius, and to be themselves transformed in the process, end quote. The key to the transformation, Jung says, lies in the containing power of the archetypes, the primordial images that alone have, to quote, a spellbounding power over Mercurius, and do not allow that useful though dangerous enemy to escape, end quote. The primordial image that best suits this task is the conjunctio, the union of opposites. Discovering an unconscious couple and recognizing that it is the creative source of an interaction beyond the powers of the conscious personality is often a discovery accompanied by awe. This can be a numinous moment. It is a here and now experience of the archetypal transference. The discovery of the couple, through being affected by the inductive processes of the third area, the discovery, I underline, can lead to its introjection as an internal center, an internal coital couple. Jung's alchemical approach to the transference allows us to situate projective identification in a proper container for its mercurial-like ambiguities. Through the woodcuts from the rosarium, we may recognize the workings of projective identification as it is coupled with the larger process of the evolution of the third area of relations. This evolution includes transformation such that compulsion and the tendency towards concretization is gradually refined away. Projective identification plays a key role in creating the illusions and arrogance that would identify the ego with such processes. But it also leads to the capacity to discover the unconscious couples, which are the central images of the third area. And now to discuss this further, I would like to go to some slides from the rosarium. Can we do that, please? Let's turn the lights down a little more for the first one, please. You have to use your imagination. Picture 1 of the Rosarium, the mercurial fountain, is an attempt to depict the mysterious basis of the opus. At the top of the picture is the divided or two-headed serpent. It spews out the poisonous fumes of the prima materia, which contain the 7 planets or metals in evil mixture and disorder. Jung says, quote, "These are the 2 vapors whose condensation initiates the process which leads to a multiple distillation for the purpose of purifying away the clinging darkness of the beginning," end quote. Now we have in this picture a combination of several ideas. On the one hand, there is the imagery of the massa confusa, or prima materia, the hostile elements which appear through projective identification. On the other hand, the soul is represented in a split upper and lower form. Splitting and projective identification are thus portrayed, but most crucially, the upper and lower are connected through the fumes. These vapors, which, as Jung has said, initiate the process, I believe form a perfect analogy to projective identification. Through working with them, the alchemist sublimated or distilled away the states of unconscious identity filled with split and hostile opposites. They link above and below, the mind-body or spirit instinct split inherited in our Western culture since Plato and before. The awareness that projective identification can link above and below instinctual and mental processes is thus a clear part of the alchemical image in the mercurial fountain. In the mercurial fountain, these vapors are shown in their ambivalent form. They link above and below. Yet, as the commentaries on these fumes show, they also block the sun and the moon. Project chemical sulfur as a captor of the imagination, rendering it dull and lifeless in states of the nigredo. Yet, through imaginally working with the fumes, their sulfuric quality can be transformed. The alchemical process had to transform the state of projective identification into a positive one without undervaluing its dark and negative form. The art, apparently, was to value the obstruction of the sun and the moon by the 2 vapors. We have to value the darkness and unpleasantness of despair and the tormenting, soulless state of mindlessness, lessons we have to learn in psychotherapy over and over again. The alchemical model in the Rosarium works with the imagery of a couple that must be transformed through states of dangerous fusion and confusion. For example, projective identification dominates picture 2, the left-hand contact. We could have the lights a little higher now. I can't do it by myself. It's not going to work through meditation. That's better. Okay, very good. As I was saying, the alchemical model in the Rosarium works with the imagery of a couple that must be transformed, a couple that must be transformed through states of dangerous fusion and confusion. For example, projective identification, as I was saying, dominates picture 2, the left-hand contact. The perverse fascination of incest, writes Jung, like tentacles of an octopus, twine themselves round doctor and patient, end quote. But there is a goal, for the hidden meaning of the incest, he tells us, is revealed to be a repulsive symbol for the unio mystica. Furthermore, the incest energies, which are thoroughly identified with projective identification, link and identify spiritual processes with the chthonic depths of sexuality. This inclusion of the bodily erotic element through projective identification is essential to the alchemical work. Through it, further transformation of the interactive field can take place, but not without a careful attention to the duplicity and dangers of projective identification. Picture 3 addresses this, for in the commentary to Naked Truth, as this picture is called, we have what amounts to a litany against narcissism, especially against the pride and arrogance that would lose sight of the greater than ego powers at work. In picture 4, the process again returns to the erotic energies exposed through projective identification. The energies, which are now a mysterious bath for the transformation of the unconscious couple. Not the conscious couple, the unconscious couple. This leads to picture 5, the conjunctio. Here, alternating states of fusion and distance, the opposites whose painful conflict is usually denied and falsified by the deceptions of projective identification, is transcended in a new rhythmical harmony. Following the conjunctio, we see the emergence of a new hermaphroditic structure, now defining the nature of the third or transitional area. This appears here in picture 6, the nigredo, a state of death traced to the incestuous intertwining of projective identification. This both causes the death of the conjunctio and leads to its further transformation. Picture 7. The stage in the Rosarium, known as the extraction of the soul, is likened by Jung to a schizophrenic dissociation. Now, up to this point in his analysis, he has largely employed the model of union, or the conjunctio, based upon the image of the hieros gamos. In other words, upon a state that can reflect the unconscious relationship between two people. In analyzing picture 7, Jung moves more towards another root of the conjunctio in alchemy, namely the unio mystica, the solitary ascent of the soul to God. This is significant, clinically significant. While two people engaging in the state depicted by picture 7 may experience extreme disorientation, there is more happening than meets the eye. Analyst and analysand may experience a severely soulless condition, an absence of linking. Metaphors such as being in parallel or alternate universes come to mind. The experience is often frightening and, for the analyst, can be humbling unless his narcissistic defenses are too strong. For the state of absolutely being in no true contact is difficult to accept for anyone who prides himself in connecting to people and to psyche. At this juncture, symbolized by this picture, Many projective identification interpretations are possible. Many are possible. But these will only falsify the painful state of a complete absence of linking. For example, states of psychic deadness and impotence which the analyst may feel can readily be interpreted by him as an inductive effect. But this, at this stage, is off the mark and takes into the interpersonal relationship archetypal aspects which are truly beyond it. As Jung says, I quote, "The psychological interpretation of this process, denoted here, leads into regions of inner psychic experience which defy our powers of scientific description." End quote. The state imaged by this picture is notably also called the impregnatio. The hint here is that while the interpersonal relationship feels soulless, and while the individuals themselves may each feel no inner connection to the unconscious, a mystery is being enacted. The soul is ascending towards God in the unio mystica. It is a time when projective identification ceases to have interpretive value. I may interject here, commonly this is so in borderline states of mind. And in fact, projective identification only has the value of humbling us within its clumsy attempt at true understanding. It is a time shrouded in mystery and a sense of analytical failure. What happens here is often unknown even to the eye of the imagination. The mystics knew this level. This is beautifully portrayed in the following tale from Rumi, the Islamic mystic of the 13th century. A seeker knocked at the door of the beloved, God, and a voice from inside asked, "Who is it?" The seeker answered, "It is I." And the voice said, "In this house there is no I and you." The door remained locked. Then the seeker went into solitude, fasted, and prayed. A year later he returned and knocked at the door. Again the voice asked, "Who is it?" Now the believer answered, "It is you." Then the door opened. The eighth picture, the mundificatio, depicts the process of washing away the inflations that attend engaging the third area, and further refining the fusion and splitting tendencies that reside there. In other words, its evolution is furthered, a process that goes on through the entire series of 20 pictures. Jung only attended to the first 10, actually 11, to which I will also limit myself in this paper to just these 10. In the discussion, we could do the rest if it's desirable. In picture 9, the soul returns, reviving the structure that had been formed in death, and becomes the rebus, the hermaphrodite of picture 10. Could we have the lights on now, please? We don't need the slides. It's good. Now we meet a major level of achievement in the Rosarium, the creation of a structure that can be understood as a shared self between two people. It is the third body the poet Robert Bly speaks of when he writes, I quote, "They obey a third body that they share in common. They have made a promise to love that body." End quote. This is a subtle body or structure that yields wisdom, knowledge, and most crucially, kinship. It has its own autonomy within the third area. To some degree, but never fully, it can become a self within an individual, a self with male and female polarities. Such shared experiences and structures seem to me to be the goal of projective identification.
Jung's study of the transference thus allows us to grasp the mercurial nature of projective identification and to recognize it as both a trickster and wily god of revelation, forging structures in the third area. I thank you.